So please tell me what I want to know. Will she let me have a dance and hold her so tight? If she loves you, will she let me take a walk?
I'll start this narrative in 1960, when beat music and guitar groups seemed to take off here, as they did all over the country. Live music in the town since the war and before had been church music, choirs, brass bands, trad jazz and dance bands. For local young people in the 1950s and 60s, a new kind of music started to become attainable. Skiffle, a kind of homemade shuffle music, and then rock and roll. Young boys, predominantly boys anyway, around Sittingbourne and Milton, as elsewhere, began to want to emulate people that they saw singing and playing guitar on TV and film. Elvis Presley, Tommy Steele, Buddy Holly, Cliff Richard and the Shadows.
And that was just about the time when we were getting Elvis Presley rock and roll tunes, getting skiffle music. So it made me want to pick up a guitar and play even more.
In the rock and roll in the 50s, used to love it all. And when I was at school, obviously, and things like Everly Brothers and all that I used to love because of the harmony. Yeah.
Do skiffle, Lolly Donegan.
We fancied ourselves as guitarists from the age of about 10 years old.
My schoolmate Dave Wilkinson and I, even in the first form, we were obsessed with guitar groups. He decided he wanted to be a lead guitarist, so I didn't have much choice. I became the rhythm player.
The instrument to have was a guitar. If you were lucky, you'd save up pocket money or save earnings to buy a second-hand guitar, but many boys tried making them.
And I got a ukulele for Christmas. It was a plastic one, but believe it or not, it actually played. I could tune it. My dog has fleas was the tuning.
None of us could play, but we sang skiffle songs. My dad made a bass with a broom handle and a tin of dried milk.
So I bought my first guitar in 1960 and it was a £6 acoustic, got from a catalogue in the papers, and I've still got it now. It's in the garage.
No, I tried every instrument in the book, even tried a saxophone, sounded like a slaughterhouse. So thought I'd give that up and just play the mic.
Well, when I was a rhythm player, my first guitar was a John Gray, which cost a £5. My mum bought, and I think I had an amp called a Cresta.
It was a little difficult at that time trying to get, the right guitars and the right equipment because there was nowhere in town. So we used to have to travel either to Whitstable, to a place there that sold that stuff.
One of the first local groups around were the Travellers, with Terry Burr, Colin Wiles and Dave Vanderbeer. They'd evolved from a skiffle group called the Earthquakes, but became the Travellers in April 1961. Doug Presnell came in on bass guitar and they started to develop a polished act, probably styled on the Shadows model, but they were admired and emulated by many other local groups. They played at village halls, functions, youth clubs and church halls, including the Holy Trinity Hall and the Carmel Hall. During the war and since, many dances were held here, the Carmel Hall in Ufton Lane. But from 1961 it also became a regular venue for beat music. The Travellers started putting on their own dances here with invited support acts. They called these nights the Travellers' Easy Beat. It was not always plain sailing and trouble would often flare up. There was notably an incident in June 1962 which resulted in 3 convictions. Shortly after this, Colin Wiles left the Travellers and Bev Moore joined them. Unfortunately, the Carmel Hall's reputation continued into the 1970s and 80s when regular discos were held here. Paper mill employees Tim Eason and Dave Stagg learnt to play guitar. They thought about equipment, made equipment and practised. And then we would walk up to Trafalgar Square and then Tottenham Court Road and all those Charing Cross Road where all the music stores were, and that was where I bought my first real electric guitar. And I tell you what, once I got that, it was a solid Buddy Burns. I was the cat's meow. They teamed up with Jimmy Enright, who was a little bit older, on drums, and started the Rock Spots.
Continuing after playing the guitar and learning a few chords, Tim Eason, myself and Sticks Enright said, can we all go and have get together and see what we can basically achieve with what we can play and sing. And we did, and that eventually formed into the Rock Spots.
I was working at Sittingbourne Mill at the time, and a couple of the other guys there had also just got guitars, so we got together and was trying to learn how to play, and we formed a little band called the Rock Spots.
They got a break playing at the Odeon on a Saturday morning, and then started to appear for money at youth clubs and so on. Various people were involved initially, including Peter Mantle and Linda Johnson, but in 1961 they became the Rebounds, Dave Lee and the Rebounds, with Tim Eason, Dave Stagg, Dave Lee, Mick Walters and Jimmy Enright. Dave Izzard eventually took over from Jim on drums, and Jim concentrated on the management.
I was headhunted, so to speak, by Mr. Dave Stagg of Dave Lee and the Rebounds to play rhythm.
Following the Travellers' Easy Beat, the Carmel Hall became a regular venue for twist and jive dances, which the Rebounds and the Demitones used to put on themselves and jointly promote.
And another local band used to come with us, and so they would play half the night and we would play half the night. We would take turns in playing the first half or the second half.
The Night Riders had been formed around 1961 after Derek Mann had seen the Shadows perform. He'd set about making his own guitar and tried writing some songs. With friends Charlie Howe and Nigel Harrison he formed a group. Drummer Jeff Squibb and guitarist Harry Rogers were colleagues at Chatham Dockyard. Their first engagement was at a King George's Field party. Then they were befriended by the Travellers and played a spot at the Carmel Hall with them. To avoid confusion with a similar named band from Faversham, by June 1962 they had become Derek Mann and the Demitones. The Maniacs came into being in 1961. Tony Judges, Fred Kitchingham and a few other friends from Borden Grammar School got together a group. A few boys dropped out, but then they found Michael Gardner, a shop worker from Tenham, whose voice was good enough that he had nearly made it with impresario Larry Palms a year or two earlier. A younger boy, Ian Smith, was recruited on guitar, and the Maniacs were born. Typically, a group's first engagements would be youth club events or church halls or fetes and so on.
My very first gig, that was at the Conservative Hall in Milton Regis. What a lively gig that was.
In the ship down the other end of town. Oh, it was only very small. They had a little hall at the back you couldn't swing a cat in, but it's...
The first gig as the Jaguars was the Holy Trinity Hall, with an audience of about 8, including my mum. Rodney, the drummer, got so nervous he threw up on the drums halfway through.
The Tributes were formed in 1963 with Graham LaCour, Richard Klezakowski, John Jessup and David Woods. Alan Fosbury on bass didn't stay very long, which meant that John Alexander came in on bass.
But when I joined the Tributes and become a proper bass player, this is the bass. This is the very first one. A Hofner, which I think cost 37 guineas. My mum forged my father's signature on the HB form. The first gig the Tributes ever did was at the Catholic Youth Club in Carmel Hall, where I met my wife.
The Panthers were a group formed by Barry David and his brothers. Originally called the Spinners, they recruited Pat Taylor as a frontman, and the band was formed as Pat Taylor and the Panthers.
It all started out, we'd have, all of us would have a bash on the mic, and then all of a sudden they said, well, can you do that, can you do that? And then all of a sudden somebody had got us a gig in a pub. Everybody was at it, wasn't they?
The core of the Panthers were 3 David brothers, and Barry, the guitarist, was the eldest.
He had 16 weeks off with a broken leg, and he couldn't play the guitar first, but he never put it down for them 16 weeks. And some 22 years later, somebody said to me, he's a good guitarist, isn't he? I said, well, if he's not now, he never will be.
With the addition of Alan Fosbury from the Tributes on bass and John Clark on guitar, they became a proficient and hard-working 6-piece band, moving on to get work in clubs, colleges and holiday camps all over the southeast.
Most of our gigs were outside Sittingbourne, but our most regular one was we passed an audition and became the first resident pop group at the Cedars Club.
The Cedars was a club for the over 18s run by Doris Stagg. It was just off the High Street, and since the late 1950s had been putting on jazz.
But the Cedars Club had a pretty good young membership, and I was the DJ there for a short while, and played all the hits of the day, and that was the place to be. That was the place to be. They had all the local beat groups playing there.
The Cedars, beautiful. Yeah, such an intimate setting, and
they had the Dematones, they had the Travellers, the Rebounds.
It's so close knit, and you virtually knew everybody, and everybody knew one another anyway.
And there was the Maniacs. I think any one of those bands could have become professional, although it would have been very short-lived in those days.
This was a place where there was seldom trouble. Doris could sort it out. Doris Stagg's son, Malcolm, who was a student, helped out and became interested in the groups. He then took on the management of the Maniacs, who were considered by many to be the best band in town.
Out of all the bands in Sittingbourne, I think my personal favourite was the Maniacs. Brilliant. Lovely, all lovely people. Fred, brilliant drummer. So stoic it wasn't true. Mickey, chirpy, and so was Tony. Tony was the main man, I think. You know what I mean? He was the inspiration. Ian was a brilliant guitarist. He was good. Yeah. I really loved him, yeah.
By now, the fame of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones and the Dave Clark Five had caused another wave of would-be musicians.
The Black Stars were another group of friends at the grammar school.
A bigger group was gradually whittled down to 5, with guitarists Jim Valentine, Graham Price, Mike Ackhurst, with drummer Tony Richmond and frontman Michael Fowle.
I think it was in front of our parents and friends and family, a very friendly audience at the Conservative Club in Milton, where we just hired the hall and we tried ourselves out.
I think it was early 1963. And, Mick Fowle joined us at that time. He was our vocalist, but Mick only stayed with us about a year or so.
They rehearsed in Michael's garage and had a ready-made audience with their school friends. Michael Fowle left after a short time, and the group had continued success as a 4-piece.
I think so.
All decked up in our really cool blazers, white shirt, red tie, with a black star on the badge, and that got them going, didn't it?
In July 1963, at about the same time, 3 more grammar school boys started playing together and had their first gig as the Pathfinders.
One of the first gigs I can remember was Newington Village Fate.
They soon developed their group.
We needed a drummer, so we asked another classmate to move forward, but we were known as the Little Lads of R&B.
As the pop music revolution grew, the groups organised their own dances, and then other organisations looked to book pop groups for entertainment. After the very early days, any group good enough to keep attracting audiences and strong enough to stay together started to be able to make money. But this inevitably led them out of the area to Medway, to Thanet and of course to the holiday camps on the Isle of Sheppey.
Because we got the opportunity to play outside of town, up in the Medway towns, up in Canterbury and places like that.
The Medway towns, we had Gravesend, Northfleet, we played a lot. And eventually up to South London, West Wickham, etc., and places like that.
It meant that as far as the young local audiences were concerned, groups like the Rebounds, the Panthers and the Travellers, for example, disappeared for an entire summer season, and new, younger local groups would take on the youth club and the local school dances.
In an early example of this, in February 1964, a grand beat night was organised by the Sittingbourne Youth Council and held here at Borden Grammar School.
This became an annual event for a few years, and they were well attended. The Panthers, the Maniacs, the Black Stars, the Dematones and the Tributes all performed. 400 people attended, a terrific night for all concerned. Where were the Rebounds? supporting the Searchers at Herne Bay.
We were support band to the Rolling Stones down at Elizabeth Hall in Folkestone, and down at the King's Hall in Herne Bay we were support bands to the Searchers, actually the week that their Needles and Pins went to #1.
On November the 22nd, 1964, a big beach show was organised by the Round Table and held in this building behind me, which was Sittingbourne Odeon.
They had tried to get the Rolling Stones, then Manfred Mann. But in the end...
At the top of the bill were the Swinging Blue Jeans. They just had a hit with Hippie Hippie Shake.
Support acts included Marianne Faithfull, guitarist Wout Steenhuis, and 5 of Sittingbourne's own local groups.
Simon D was the person in charge who emceed it, I guess. And lots of local groups had to audition for it. We were very lucky to be chosen to be in.
In the end, it was the Cellmates, the Pathfinders, the Victors, the Sheridans and the Maniacs who made it into the lineup. At one time or another, according to fashion, nearly all the groups tried out with a female singer, but none of these collaborations lasted longer than a month or two. One group that didn't try the girl singer idea was the Pathfinders, but one of their number, Pete Brown, emigrated to Australia and Roger Fay, another grammar school boy, was brought in on bass. With Roger Stevens bringing in keyboards, they became the Syndicate.
We played all Rolling Stones, we played 1 or 2 pop songs, 1 or 2 Beatles songs, some old blues songs.
Hits of the time, the Searchers, the Who, the Kinks, Billy J. Kramer.
I used to love the Animals. I really did. Yeah. Something with a bit of depth into it.
So we had to do our best to sound like the Shadows, to sound like the Beatles, to sound like the Stones, or whoever it was.
The first, pretty much Shadows and stuff, a lot of Shadows and mainstream stuff then. It changed a few years on.
Many groups had their origins in friendships formed here at Newhouse Youth Club in Chalkwell Road.
Notably, the Rock Spots practised here early on, and later, in 1964, Terry Saint and the Disciples were playing here. These were times when it is only a slight exaggeration to say that all the boys wanted to be in a group. Other local bands around included the Starlights, the Falcons, the Rocking Vendors, the Vultures, and Grace Selman and the Cellmates.
Many functions were and still are held here at what was Bowalter's Clubhouse.
Functions would be held at places like this or like the Old Town Hall for organisations such as Bowalter's or the Round Table, and although dance bands provided proper dancing, foxtrots, quick steps and waltzes and so on, as the 60s progressed, beat groups would often be brought in as a cabaret act to do a spot in the middle of the event. In February 1965, the Youth Council Beauty Queen Selection Dance, held again at the grammar school, featured the Black Stars, the Sheridans from Faversham, the Travellers, the Syndicate and the Classics from the Medway Towns.
Some reports said that 500 people attended.
The Dematones, meanwhile, were a 4-piece and performing at a well-paid gig at the Town Hall in the High Street. The Rebounds were now without Dave Stagg on bass, so Mick Waters had moved over, and they now had brought in Dave Merrony on sax. This was the way things were going in 1965. The older bands were seeking fame and fortune elsewhere. The aim of turning pro was always a holy grail of groups. But as these young men grew up, the demands of either further education, earning a living, or family caused many groups to split or at least to change direction. The Travellers, who had been a trio since Dave Vanderpeer left them, broke up in early 1965, with Terry Burr then joining the Panthers and Doug Presnell joining the Dematones. Younger groups were coming along and a new image was being sought. The Tributes broke up and became the Dylans for a while. The Pathfinders had become the Syndicate and the Dematones became Pico's People. By 1966 it was a different scene. The grammar school dance had a line-up with a lot of new names, and it was all change. The Avengers, the Moonrakers, the Sheridans, the Bombers, the Abject Blues and the Rebounds. The Black Stars added keyboards and another singer, venturing into soul music, becoming Immediate Pleasure in 1966. A new young Sittingbourne group emerged, still in their early teens and schoolboys at Westlands and St John's in 1966. The Senators comprised Dennis Hills, Paul Clinch, Dave Croucher and Frankie Boswell. In subsequent years, they went on, like those before them, to play the holiday camps and functions and to remain popular into the 1970s, embracing new music like reggae before eventually renaming and transforming. The Maniacs continued with ex-Moonraker Paul Dance on drums until 1967, when their friend and manager Malcolm Stagg was involved in a bad car accident. For this group, as with many others, careers outside of music had started to become more lucrative and more important than pleasure. The Rebounds continued with Tony Wood replacing Mick Walters on bass until about 1968, when they added a trumpet and became the Clockwork Sponge. By 1967, the Demitones had become Pico's People with Paul Dance on drums.
The Cedars Club closed in 1969. It had hosted beat music for 5 years. Its closure brought the 1960s scene in Sittingbourne neatly to a close.
It was just such a fantastic time to be a teenager. Everything was new.
Everything just seemed wonderful. The music was wonderful, the fashion was wonderful, the cars were wonderful. Not that I could afford one, of course, but it was just great to be young at that time.
I'd recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, best days of our life, I think. And
The times were very good. The 60s, I mean, there were lots of friends and stuff like that. It wasn't too heavy.
Well, never to be forgotten. Brilliant. You know. It was just sort of. I really feel sorry for the kids today.
but in those days, everybody went out more anyway to these sort of venues, and live music was the thing.
It was quite good. Good atmosphere.
Brilliant time to be in a band. Absolutely brilliant time to be in a band. Which probably is why there were so many bands in and around Sittingbourne. Great bands, great times.
The boys and girls involved and even the groups are too numerous for me to mention them all here. But I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the early 1960s. Thanks for watching. If you have found this video interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit our website.